Hi everyone, welcome to this very exciting live Q&A. My name's Leena, I'm a poet and I work in the UK publishing industry. I actually started out as a bookseller, so I'm very excited to be talking all about books tonight, or maybe perhaps this is your day. We're here with D.W. Young. He is the director and editor of the amazing documentary we all just watched. D.W., how are you today?
Good, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, I'm not too bad. I'm not too bad. All the better for having watched that. It's the second time I've watched it now, so it's
Oh,
been
really?
a lovely experience. Yeah, I know. Feeling like I know them personally. It makes me want to hop on a plane to New York and browse some bookshops. But I'll keep that in for now.
Yeah.
One day. So we're going to be taking lots of questions from the audience. So do drop your questions in the comments on YouTube if you're watching live. I have a few of my own, so I'm going to corner you first before I have to give you over to them.
Okay.
So you've worked on a huge variety of projects. You've had a really fascinating career. You've worked on Hole in a Fence, which was about gentrification, a Favour for Jerry, which was shot during real time during the 2016 election, which is amazing. And then also Happy House, which is kind of like horror suspense kind of film. Tell me what drew you to this project? What brought you to the Booksellers?
Yeah, well, I try very consciously to do something really different with each project and really try and challenge myself to take on something, whether in terms of the concept or the style of it or whatever, to really push myself. But so that maybe explains a little bit of it. But also you have to be very opportunistic making films, right? Because rarely do you make the film you're planning to make half the time, right? Like something else comes along, and that was a little bit what happened with this. The idea for the project really originated with our other producer, Dan Wexler, who is a rare book dealer in New York. And he's also done some film work. And Judith Mizraki, our producer, she and I are actually also married and have worked together many times on the films you've mentioned. And she'd worked on one of his films and we'd all become friends. We knew a DP in common. And he mentioned over lunch, I think it was like 7 years ago, that he'd always thought a film about the rare book world, documentary needed to be done. It had never been done that he knew of. He obviously knew a lot of people in that world and had a sense of that world from being inside it. And we really latched on to the idea, I think, right away. I sort of had a literary background. I was sort of an aspiring writer and published some things as early on before I sort of switched to film, and had a great love, for books and bookstores, and had an aunt and uncle who were dealers way back when. So that really was the genesis of it. I think we really latched on the idea, the possibilities. I think we recognized some of them at least right away, and then we didn't really get around to actually making the film for another like 4 years. So it was about 3 years ago that we actually seriously engaged, production with it.
Wow, that's a long journey. I love it. You I think it's interesting because obviously, like what the documentary kind of showed is not just that these booksellers are incredible salespeople, incredible marketers, but they're also incredible historians.
Yeah.
I feel like the Booksellers was kind of also kind of meta in that you were being the historian for these historians. You were kind of recording their story. Did you go in with a hypothesis of like, right, this is what I want to say when I do this documentary. This is the kind of angle I'm looking for. These are the questions I want to ask. Or did you go in with a kind of blank slate and we're just like, I just want to hear what they have to say?
I think I thank you for saying that, because I like that. I think it's a bit of both. I think I very much didn't want to go in with too fixed an idea or a commitment to any one thing, because then I think you're kind of working against the process of discovery that's a part of making a documentary like this, certainly. And you can maybe closing your mind off to things that may develop as you go, or I certainly learned a lot in making the movie, and I don't think I learned anything. Whatever research I did on the side was nothing even compared to what I learned from the people in the movie. So my thinking about a lot of things changed as I went. I mean, I think I had certain intuitions about things and a feeling that we would do things. And I think we had talked a lot about various aspects, that many of which are in the film, that in some form or another we would want to address them. And the question was, to what degree, how that would fit in with everything else, I think was left a little more open-ended. But we certainly had things in mind that from the get-go that we wanted to address.
Yeah, definitely. I also think it was interesting, the kind of detective aspect of the Booksellers, and I actually did not know that Louisa May Alcott was also a pulp writer, so I'm definitely going to go and search out her books. about that. How did you go kind of being a detective in the booksellers world and kind of like tracking down these people and working out who is best to interview? Because I also liked the aspect to, you know, recognizing that it had been this very upper class white male kind of industry and how that had changed and grown and kind of morphed. How did you go about picking who to include, or was it just who you could track down?
No, I mean, I think on the one hand, I mean, if you go to like the Antiquarian Book Fair, there's so many potential subjects and many really more than you could hope for in a documentary, I think. And really all of them, so many articulate and interesting people you could talk to. I think by narrowing it down to New York just to start, that helped us put a, you know, confine, although there are a few Brits that show up and a few other, but generally speaking, the main people are from New York. And Dan was a great help there because he knew some good people to start off with, I think, speaking to, and that kind of got us a leg up. And then so from there, you know, I think the dealers themselves often made recommendations. But you know, I think it's like this idea of you every step of the way you're trying to find a balance. I mean, we always wanted, when going back to things we had in mind from the beginning. I mean, I think we committed pretty much from the outset to the idea that it wasn't going to be focused on just one or two dealers. That we were going to try and get a broader scope, and that meant talking to a broader, you know, array of people who represented different facets of the trade and different generations and different kinds of, you know, material that they handled. And so I think inevitably then that's a balancing act, and sort of you develop it as you go too. So I think, you know, we started with a few people and then kind of worked our way onwards from there. And for the most part, you know, everyone was really pretty enthusiastic about being involved.
Yeah, I can imagine. They all seemed like really excited to get their collections out and show
Right.
you. And I think,
They do like
sorry,
sharing, yeah.
yeah, and
Sharing
I
what
think,
that aspect.
yeah, because I think it takes a bit of an eccentric to collect in that kind of really passionate way. Were there any kind of expectations you had like going into some of the interviews, and was there any particular moments you can remember that surprised you, or moments when you were like, wow, I wasn't expecting them to say that, or wasn't expecting them to have that in their collection?
Yeah. I think, you know, a lot of what surprised me, and I mentioned this once before elsewhere, but is I didn't realize going in how much the rare book trade encompasses things that aren't, you know, material objects that aren't books. And
Yeah,
you know, I think autographs or manuscripts maybe you have a sense of, even maps maybe, but it really keeps going from there. And so, I mean, you see, we have an auction briefly on screen where there's an Enigma machine from World War II. There's strange Victorian board games. There's all kinds of weird photography stuff. And you know, so I didn't really understand going in how much the rare book trade has become more about, I think, items of cultural and historical relevance that, you know, as is mentioned in the film, don't really fall into one clear category elsewhere. So that was that was a definite surprise to me.
yeah, definitely. Did the human skin book as well, was that something that you were expecting to find? I didn't know that's a thing that existed, but was that?
I think it's called anthropodermic. I really like that word.
Yeah,
Uh,
anthropodermic.
yeah. No, I didn't know about that. And we tried to see if we could track down the owners, because we didn't see in person
Mm.
those those findings. And we tried to see if we could get the owners who have them in their collection to let us view them in person, but they didn't want to. I think
I didn't want to share.
obviously it's a very private kind of thing that most people don't own up to collecting, probably. So we had to make do with the photos, but I think I would have touched them.
Yeah, no, that's the thing. It's that thing of like, would I want to? I don't know. It's a piece of history, I guess. Say that word again. Anthro
I believe it's anthropodermic.
Anthropodermic. I kind of want to use that word again, but wonder when I'll ever have cause to use it. So I'll try and store it just in
Well,
case.
will you remember it 30 years from now, I think, is the
Yeah,
question.
yeah.
That
Well,
moment
yeah.
finally comes, right?
Finally. So we've got a question from somebody in the audience. Why did you choose to film using jazz music as a soundtrack for the film?
Well, I would say it's half jazz. And so,
Okay.
and I like that it's a kind of split soundtrack. I think that's something we did that was a little um, unusual, but I think I had something in mind there. So first of all, the composer for the film, David Ullman, and I have worked together many times. We have a really great relationship, and I consider him a really important creative collaborator. And he is, although I think he's a great composer in any form, he is first and foremost a jazz musician and composer. So I think it's a natural fit for him. I think jazz, for the kind of energy of New York, and it's kind of a classical New York vibe, and I think that kind of worked for aspects of the film. And so I loved also that we had once before done where he had written some jazz pieces and we recorded them in a studio with some jazz musicians where they just kind of come in and they can look at this music and start recording like right away, and it's amazing to me as someone who's not a musician. So with these great jazz musicians, you get, I think, a much more organic, kind of analog feel, and it sounds like it's like a real recording session. And so I felt like that kind of fit the subject matter, and it's classic sort of in that way. But then there's another portion of the film that's more, I think, more aligned with more common documentary composed longer
Mm.
cues or small pieces and stuff. And so I thought David did a lot of great work there too. And so I think that kind of juxtaposition of the two hopefully kind of drives the movie in different ways at times.
Yeah, definitely. It also reminds me of like quite the kind of music that they play sometimes in when you browse a bookshop. It kind of
Right.
gives me that kind of feeling. Spotify even actually has a playlist that's called like bookshop playlist. You can
Really?
play in the background, pretend you're
That's
in a
funny.
bookshop, and it's full of jazz. We've got a question from Billy here. Can you talk about how you developed this film? It's clearly a clearly fascinating world, one you've offered an amazing window into. But how did you find an entry point and build the narrative? So I guess that's also a kind of question I had, because I guess there's two ways you could have done it. You could have picked one bookseller and kind of
Right.
followed them through their perspective and their world. But instead you took on a bit more of a mammoth task and used all of these incredible, like the kind of credits are amazing, the amount of people you fitted in. How did you build that narrative?
Well, that goes back to, I think, again, we'd committed to the concept of it not being one person early on.
Mm.
And what I felt like, I wanted to make the movie more of an experience of this world, and it would never be a complete experience, obviously, but I wanted it to feel like somehow you'd moved through this world, and that, you'd experience it in a kind of more intimate way, in a more conversational way. And so to do that, is a challenge when you have a lot of people. I think, again, it was a sort of half and half kind of thing where I think something like that has to be done creatively, a lot of it in the editing later, because I
Mm.
don't think it's just, I think, absurd to think you could perfectly conceive it in advance. So, and as an editor, I'm familiar kind of with planning though for what you will need. But we kept adding things even to the right to the end, of course. Um, but I think 50%, I had a lot of ideas in mind structurally about certain, things that would be kind of, key moments structurally. And the idea of like essentially opening and closing on the book fair was early on. And I kind of
Mm.
thought that this was a kind of extremely loose, I mean really loose, but just sort of vague feeling of almost like a year in the life, but not really, but it almost like a full circle kind of feeling. And then the idea to do the opening closing montages came a little later on, but it was, I think, in the middle of filming at some point. I felt like I wanted something more poetic even than the book fair, which is really like, high energy, high octane. But so I think, various things like that. And then the idea of highlighting more certain of the dealers a little bit more, and spending a little more time with them was there fairly early on. So I think we had things we committed to more or less, but we also then kept adding and developing in the editing. And one thing that didn't pan out as much, I mean, I thought it was great, but we couldn't use as much of it in the end. I couldn't make it fit. I held on to it a really long time. Was at the end there's a dinner scene where a bunch of the dealers are together
Yeah.
having dinner. We actually shot an entire dinner of them in almost like a more like loose narrative kind of feeling even, where we just let them talk and chat and um, kind of go their own way with their discourse, which I think was an interesting attempt to get at something from a less traditional documentary format. And we got a lot of great stuff, but I felt like one thing too much to cram into the movie. But at the end of the day, some of it was usable, I think, at the end in a good way. So it was worth it no matter what.
Extras for the DVD release,
Right.
perhaps. I'd love to see that. I have a question from KL. Was it challenging to get people to share what they had in their homes and their collections, or were they happy to share their interests? Because obviously it's quite intimate and they had to trust you guys as well that you're going to treat it well. And
Yeah,
I guess also from a money perspective, everything's quite expensive. So letting a whole crew in there with all their
it is.
equipment
Well,
is scary.
we were a very small, very nimble, very unobtrusive
Yeah.
crew, and it was generally me and our DP Peter doing most of everything. And I do like to work that way for some things like this because I feel like it makes interviews much more intimate and comfortable, especially for people who aren't used to
Mm.
being interviewed a lot. And it also just makes you lean and mean kind of, and lets you, kind of have a if you have a close working relationship, like Peter and I developed a really good working relationship, I think of being able to, on the fly adjust quickly and have our own little code about what we're doing. But most of the dealers were pretty happy to talk to us, so that was good. A couple just weren't comfortable being on camera, I think,
Mm.
fundamentally, and so which I totally sympathize with. So they didn't want to show us things. But in terms of showing the actual objects, for the most part, we didn't go really close up on anything super outrageously valuable that, like, oh my God, there goes $200,000 or anything.
Yeah.
So people, I think, were generally okay with it. I mean, we were very careful, obviously, in how we approached any actual physical objects, and keeping a certain distance, or ensuring that they handled it perhaps first and we just shot it, or I was standing there double holding the camera so it couldn't fall over, or whatever it was. So we were very careful. People were generally okay with it. So we didn't have any problems that way, thankfully.
Yeah, just in
As
case.
it can be, the Gatsby was a little nerve-wracking. The owner
Yeah.
of that was a little nervous, like, for sure, and I was nervous because that's a very valuable book.
Yeah.
And so, but it worked out all as well.
I would think that, and also the mammoth hair that he had.
Yeah, but that was in the book and
Yeah, I
pretty
suppose
well
sort of
sealed, and
encased.
yeah. And Dave was handling it, so I think when they're handling it, they're used to it. It's amazing. What I'm amazed by is how confident everyone in this world is,
Mm.
handling stuff that's so potentially fragile. And I think, I saw Terry Osborne at the time at Recent Company. She handled this $350,000 map. She just unfolded and held it up, and it was, really quite fragile. And I was like, just really impressed with the kind of confidence to just be that, brisk about handling it.
Yeah, I guess they kind of have this amazing skill that's kind of like almost like wand Ollivander-esque, where they just know, and it's kind of like playing the piano. They know how to handle it. They know how to touch it and what it's composed of. It's really interesting. I've got a question from Paper Wishing Stars. Do you hope that the documentary will inspire young book lovers to look at the antiquarian or rare book selling world as a potential career? If it's
Sure,
there, that's the other
yeah,
thing that makes scary thing about the end of the film. People saying it might not be there.
no, absolutely. I
That's
mean, I sure. It's not like, I don't think the movie was created as an act of advocacy, but I'm happy if, as a um, component along the way, that it does, do that, whether it has to do with more younger people, from a broader range of backgrounds coming into the book trade. That's great. Obviously, I think the movie makes
mm,
pretty clear that that seems like would be essential to the trade, becoming more modernized and more equal, and moving forward in the future. So that would be great. And I think what's really interesting, one other thing that was interesting to me is, was discovering kind of the degree to which a lot of the stuff that people are collecting now, that are people who are younger, who might not have even always, like, thought of themselves as being in the rare book trade, like Sarita, I think, with the hip hop stuff that she's archiving and curating. She might not have, I think, necessarily when she started, but then thought of it quite that way. But I think as she went along and worked with Arthur on other things, and like, it really kind of, she sort of felt a little more aligned there. And Arthur himself, as a dealer in the film, I think he absolutely is in the rare book world, but sometimes I think he jokes about some of the stuff I work with. People don't even think of it as being in the rare book world. Some of that counterculture, sort of really a super ephemeral stuff. So I think, the idea that the trade could become just even more interesting and more vibrant by, an influx of new people is absolutely a great thing.
And I think it's also really interesting because I think the pandemic has brought to light how tactile the world really is, and how much people actually really do enjoy physically going to see people and buying a book physically, being able to touch objects. And yeah, I don't know, it's been a really interesting discussion in the UK publishing industry, because people are really missing, the London Book Fair, and missing all
Yeah.
these things where people get to see each other. And I don't know, I think I have great hopes for the rare book selling world. I think we're still tactile humans. We're still human. We're still in 3D. So I think digitizing it would be a shame. Kathy has a question that I also was curious
Okay.
about. Did you buy any books from the dealers while you were filming, and if so, which ones?
Well, so that's a good question. I didn't really have money to spend on a lot of the higher end material, being,
Yeah.
handled. And I think even more importantly, there was never any time to really browse. That was the killer thing for me, is I would love to have, in so
Yeah.
many of these places, just like walked around and spent many hours. But when you're making a documentary like this, everything's always a rush. You don't have a lot of time. So I never got to spend the time looking myself personally in so many of these places. And I'm not really a rare book collector at all. I mean, I like to buy books, but just to read essentially. And I'm leery a little bit of, I mean, it's become more tempting to me that if I had more time and, resources and an idea, perhaps like a real something to latch onto for an interesting collection, it's much more it's much more alluring to me now than it was when I started the movie in some respect. But I haven't gone down that path. But the one book I did buy, and it's not really, I wouldn't even call it a rare book, but it was just a nice copy, was from Left Bank Books, who had opened a new small shop in the West Village, and you see them. It was a shoe store in the beginning, and then it's their bookstore. There's a copy of AIDS and Its Metaphors from Susan Sontag, which I had never read, I'd been on my reading list, and they had a really nice bound hardback copy, first edition. I think it was the first edition. I picked that.
So you're going to read it as well?
I read it. That was a while ago. I've read it since.
Yeah. Okay.
But you could really, it's a slippery slope. Like.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? And then once you have a few, because I'd suggest for you, I'd be like, if a niche one, you could collect books about booksellers.
Oh yeah, I mean, they're crazy. Anything you can think of.
Yeah, like 84 Charing Cross Road kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, I've got a question from Neil. Your film generally covered the top end of the book trade. Do you consider the lower end that feeds into it? I don't really know what the lower end is. Perhaps you know more about it than me. Do you mean like the kind of grand houses that have their sales, or maybe that?
I suspect. Well, I think the lower end is, it seems to me, from my understanding, has changed a lot because of the internet, and so I think that so many dealers who weren't the very top end exclusive higher end stuff, there used to be much more of their stock and trade, a combination of the two things. And I would say that although everyone in the movie more or less handles does handle high end material on some level, a number of them also handle much more modest stuff too. And even Jim Cummins' warehouse with the 350,000 books, and there's another 100,000 between his house and his offices in New York. The books in that warehouse are actually fairly low end. That's like his less expensive stock. But I think the lower end dealers, I think that could be street dealers in New York, street vendors, although there aren't so many as there used to be. And I think that would be probably a good example of it. Or used bookstores used to just, in general, when they were more widespread here, I think have a combination of some more low end. But I just think that's been reduced a lot here. But I think, it'd be great for someone to make a movie about that too. Sure. I mean, we can only cram so much in. And at the end of the day, it was like, what do you commit to? So.
Yeah, definitely. That makes sense. Rachel asks, was there anything filmed that you loved but didn't quite fit the narrative of the film that you had to exclude in the edit? So I guess part of that was that party we were talking about. Was there anything else that you wish you could have?
Yeah, so the party, obviously the dinner was a big one. There's two that I managed to put on as DVD extras in the US, so hopefully they'll make it to the UK. One, I had an idea about doing a little piece, something in the film about all the lingo and the sort of odd, obscure terminology of the rare book trade. And there's a book called Carter's ABC, which is like a dictionary of terminology for the rare book trade that a lot of people use as a reference. But I just couldn't make it work at the end. It was like too big. But so we spun that off as a short film, and the New Yorker played it here in the US, and it's on the DVD here as an extra. So hopefully that might be available. I think it's region locked though for the UK.
Okay.
I'm not sure, and then Kara Schlesinger, who is the restorer and binder and preservationist, who briefly talks about books surviving through time near the end of the film. We had a great talk with her. She's really cool. The stuff she does, I think, is amazing. And I loved what we got from that interview. And again, it was just became a little too much of a tangent, a little too hard to really fully fit in as another topic in the movie. But there's again on the DVD, we kept it and we're able to use it as a small feature on her that goes more into depth in what she does and kind of the tools she uses and her process of, preserving some of these unbelievably sort of beat up old books, which is pretty cool.
That's so cool. There's a question from Marquina that I thought was an interesting one because it made me think about it towards the end as well. Did your understanding of what a book is change after the making of the film? Because obviously there was those horrible shots of Nazis burning books and this kind of quite unique attachment that we have to books that isn't really there for other kinds of objects. Did you come out with anything that changed?
Yeah, I mean, I think stuff like, but in terms of books as having that kind of political power and as a, you know, means of resistance to oppression, and I think books is sort of, you know, this sort of cornerstone of our sort of human, you know, culture and sort of identity. I felt going in. I think that's something I imposed on the movie in many respects. But I think it's more the things that were really specific to the rare book trade that I didn't fully appreciate and came out of with a much greater understanding. And I think
Mm.
that could be one, how books hold secrets and can, you know, discoveries can be made, like a la the Louisa May Alcott situation.
Yeah.
And I think even more, and sort of related to that, and it's what I think William Reese talks about a lot, is this, how much information a specific physical copy of a book can have that's unique to it as a physical book, and that one copy of that physical book. I think I had some sort of, I had a, you know, a sense of that, but it became much more pronounced after making the movie.
Yeah, definitely. Do you have a sense of there were so many different things that were covered, but like a sense of how, I mean, obviously the documentary's there to make a history of what these people are doing and their kind of like incredible skills and passion. But do you have a sense of the people who've watched the film and felt moved to be like, I really want this to still be around? Like the biggest things that are kind of stopping this industry from continuing or growing, and if there's anything that we can do. I think what was interesting was like the three women who were like, oh, they were like, why have you been able to carry on so long? And they're like, real estate, we own
Yeah,
this.
yeah.
Like, what are the biggest things that are facing those booksellers now?
Well, I think, you know, in terms of New York and the U.S., the book landscape, certainly of New York, and this is something we had in mind from all of us from having lived in New York so long, and who made the movie, and that we'd witnessed the book landscape of New York change so much in the last 25 years, and alone, not let alone, you know, obviously before that even, but really between Barnes and Noble and then Amazon and the closure of so many bookstores, it really, the city lost, to me, some of its essential character and what made, you know, it a compelling place.
Mm.
And so I think, you know, that was something that, you know, was part of the thinking of what's important, but I don't think we're going to go back to that, you know.
Mm.
So obviously I think browsing, frequenting, buying physical books is a value always, and will help the rare book trade and will help publishing and help all of this continue. I think, you know, I think what I was really struck with, and again, it's more on the collecting side, but if you know, Heather and Rebecca in the film, they talk briefly about their prize, the Honey and Wax Prize, for new younger women collectors, and who often may not have even thought of themselves as collectors in a
Yeah.
formal sense. If you actually go and look at some of the stuff those people are doing in more detail, it's really fascinating, and I think it's not generally valuable at all. And I think it's very of the moment, and it's people of, you know, in their 20s really doing stuff that I wouldn't, you know, probably have thought of at all, or even necessarily always find that interesting. But I think it's absolutely interesting and relevant that they're doing it, and that it will, and it definitely has merit and will be interesting for other people and down the line. But I think a lot of it is very interesting. I'm not to discount at all. I'm
Yeah,
just saying
yeah.
it's of a different generation, and I think it's really cool. And so I think there's a lot of possibility there for people if they just don't think about it in the traditional sense necessarily entirely.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's this kind of human impulse to collect and to preserve that I think won't go away, however it kind of remanifests itself. Obviously, I've been asking you lots and lots about books, but the other aspect of it that I'd love to pick your brain on is the process of making the documentary like this. Like, do you have anything? There's probably people watching who are aspiring kind of documentary makers. Do you have any like steers for them, things you wish you'd known, the way you put stuff together, or like, I don't know, anything, any learnings?
Well, if you make a movie in New York and you have to drive back and forth a lot, be ready for a lot. You know, it's like the things like traffic that, you know, even if you live in the city, when you engage it, and I've made other films in New York, but this one, like, this is a non-answer really, but this one, like the traffic, the driving, the back and forth was just ridiculous.
True
So it's like the
documentaries are made in the car.
no, so it's funny. It's just, you know, like we made this for very modestly and very, I think, you know, I think, and so that's like the thing you're not worried about, but yet becomes the great labor of the movie is like
Yeah.
the first, the talking to people, all that is fine. You know, kind of how it's gonna, what it entails and what the job is, but it's these other things when you're doing things. I think when you have enough money, a lot of that can be kind of wiped away. But of course, when you're doing it more independently, sometimes it's the funny little things. But I think, you know, you just I think if you have a good idea, you know, with a documentary these days, unless there's tremendous overhead costs involving licensing or something, I think the ability to jump right into it in a lot of respects is what's so great about now with the tools at our disposal. And so I think, you know, don't wait too long to just get started. You know, if
Mm.
you have something you want to try out. And I think the other thing about documentary that I feel like now is ever more relevant with so much of, you know, how we view movies online, and that length is not so important anymore.
Mm.
I think, I mean, yes, if you truly are committed to having to have a theatrical run, or you definitely want to have, you know, that 60-minute, 90-minute exact broadcast length because you're really positioning that way or something. I mean, that's one thing. But I think in general, does anyone care with now if they're watching a movie, a documentary that's interesting, if it's 50, 60, 80, 65? I mean, I feel like it's just not that important anymore. And that should be like a liberating thing. So, because I feel like in the past, this idea that you had to get to your full feature length, you know, caused
Yeah.
sometimes people to cram a lot in, and maybe that it could have been a stronger thing if they just could have trimmed it down a bit. So, you know,
Yeah.
I think that freedom can be a liberating thing, maybe more
Yeah,
going
and it
forward.
makes sense. And I think it's also that we have so much technology now that means we can capture stuff so fast. And it is, I guess, making a documentary is kind of like collecting books in some way, that you collect all these clips and then afterwards
Yeah.
you catalog them in the right order. And
Well,
yeah.
yeah, you can do it there's any number of approaches. And I think the technology aspect for me is, I think, far more sort of having far more immediate impact, and offers a lot more immediate potential on the low end for documentary than for, like, you know, more established narrative filmmaking. Oh, there's obviously lots of technological stuff, but I think, you know, endless drone shots aside, as everyone jokes about, because now, you know, you can buy a drone for a few
Yeah.
$100. But, like, you know, the simple fact of, like, the proliferation of incredibly high quality now cell phone cameras alone allows for a gathering of images and information in settings and scenarios by anyone in
Yeah.
ways that were never possible before. And that alone, I think, allows a tremendous opening of potential. Not to say you want to make every movie that way, but, like, that's just an aspect of it. And, you know, we did things in this film with like a small slider. We got some, like, sort of poor man's dolly shots, but I think it looks good. And gimbals and all this stuff. It's allowing, I think, for more interesting potential documentary filmmaking at a much lower, you know, buy-in point.
Yeah, definitely. Are you in touch with any of the booksellers now?
A little bit, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. And you know, um, we talked to them, and everyone seems to be doing okay right now, so that's
that's
thankfully
good.
good.
Yeah.
Um, and I think, you know, they're all, for some of them, I think this is not so hard because a lot of them work out of offices and they're still able to send books abroad and conduct business.
Mm.
So that's been, I think, okay. But obviously, for the folks who have the bookstores and the storefronts, especially the big ones like Argosy and Strand, this is, you know, tough.
Yeah, they've got to sit tight. Well, thank you so much for speaking to us, DW. It's been absolutely fascinating. For those of you who watched and loved the documentary, you can watch it again. It's on iTunes or anywhere that you can access films now in the UK. And also, the Bertha Dock House are also next week at the same time, if you want to tune in, a screening, a black gay classic called Tongues Untied, which looks amazing. I'm going to be tuning in next week for that. Thank you so much, DW,
Thanks
for
so
chatting
much.
to us,
Thanks for
and
having me.
thank you for making such an incredible documentary. I think it's going to be around for years to come.
Thanks. Take care. See
Brilliant.
you then.
Bye.